Okay, thank you, Vishenka. I was very touched by that. I feel very touched to be giving this talk, actually, so it will be my last formal talk as chair. So I'm going to start this talk by reading the quote again that I read last night and that you all have a copy of. And I just invite you to just sit and listen and notice your response as you hear what I say. Some people say that Buddhism is just an Eastern religion. This is what some Christians in the West say. They say that because Buddhism is an Eastern religion, it cannot be understood and practiced by people in the West. Such Christians forget that Christianity itself is of Eastern origin. But Buddhism is, in fact, not an Eastern religion. It's a universal religion. Even though Buddhism originated in India, it spread over the whole earth. Buddhism can be understood and practiced anywhere in the world, because Buddhism addresses itself to the individual human being, regardless of race, nationality, caste, sex, or age. Buddhism is therefore a religion of man. I guess these days we'd say a religion of humanity. This is one of the reasons why I am a Buddhist. I believe that humanity is basically one. I believe that it is possible for any human being to communicate with any other human being, to feel for any other human being, to be friends with any other human being. This is what I truly and deeply believe. This belief is part of my own experience. It is part of my life. It is part of me. I cannot live without this belief, and I would rather die than give it up. To me, to live means to practice this belief. Therefore, this belief is part of my religion. It has nothing to do with the way I dress, the way in which I dress, nothing to do with what I call myself. It is the matter of the way I am, the way I exist. It is the way I naturally function in the world. This is what religion really is. It is what you most truly and deeply believe. It is what you are prepared to die for. It is your life. It is what makes you what you are. It is what makes you behave in the way that you do. Religion is therefore a very important thing. In fact, it is the most important thing. So just be quiet for a moment and just get a sense of your response to all that. So my task this morning is really just to explore a couple of aspects within that quote. My good friend Vishenka over there allocated topics between Atrashraddha, myself, and him. Okay, so and he gave me a title to work with. It's the first time I've ever been given a title to respond to, but I was happy to do this. Well, mostly happy. Because he's giving the talk that I wanted to give. Anyway, put that aside. So what he asked me to speak on, the title he gave me was Buddhism as a Universal Religion of Humanity. What are the existential truths the Buddha saw? What do they mean for us today? Well, in some ways, the question answers itself. Buddhism is a universal religion of humanity because it is directly concerned with existential truths. In some respects, I don't need to say any more. There's enough in that to talk about. But I don't think Vishenka will be happy if I leave it there, and you might feel a bit shortchanged. So in the next 30 minutes or so, or maybe a little bit longer, I'm just going to pad out that statement. I'm going to colour it in with my musings. And as I do so, I invite you to be intellectually receptive and curious about my reflections. But I also would request and invite you to be mindful. And what I mean by this is, as well as listening with your intellect, listen with your body. Be aware and notice your embodied responses to what you hear, to what I'm saying. Sometimes our bodies notice things that are wiser than our heads. Sorry, our body can be wiser than our head. If your body relaxes and feels expansive, then it's telling you something. If your body contracts and feels tight, it's telling you something. If it feels heavy, then just notice that. And take that information to your group afterwards and share it. You don't need to know why your body reacts or responds in a particular way. Just notice it and then take it to the group and explore it there. So I'm going to start with a brief exploration of what is meant by religion, and more specifically, universal religion of humanity, before asking what is meant by existential truths. Next, after that, I'll dive into the heart of the talk, which focuses on the existential truths, seen, literally or otherwise, by the Buddha. I'm going to come at this from quite a personal angle, using my own interpretations and understandings, or mainly, which you may or may not agree with. And that's fine. I'm happy for you to disagree with me. It gives you something to talk about. The question that Vishankar's posed about what these existential truths mean for us today is something I'm going to leave for you to make up your own mind about. I guess, again, that is something you could discuss in the groups. Finally, if I have time, I'm going to finish again with Bhante's quote, "Why I am a Buddhist." It might be interesting to notice if your response is the same at the end of the talk as it was at the beginning. So what makes Buddhism a universal religion of humanity? Well, not everybody, and I imagine quite a few people in this room, I know of one for sure, who doesn't like to think of Buddhism as a religion. For some people, the word religion brings up all sorts of connotations, negative connotations. But what is religion? What does it really mean? Well, the definition and etymology of the word is contested. There's no agreement on what religion actually means. According to Cicero, ancient philosopher, I guess, he said the religion, or the etymology of religion, is the Latin word religere. I don't know how to pronounce it. Religere. Re meaning again, and legere or legere meaning read. So religere or religere means to read again or to think again. And this suggests taking a second look at something, thinking more deeply about something. So that's one connotation, that's one implication of what religion is. It's about thinking again, thinking more deeply about something. However, later commentators and more contemporary scholars connect religion with the Latin word religare, with an A rather than an E, or religare, which means to bind fast. But what is it binding us to? Well, for Christians and Jews and Muslims, it conveys the notion of binding humans to God. But for Buddhists, who don't have any notion of creator God, the bond is to the Dharma, the truth, with a capital T. So I would suggest that a truly religious Buddhist is one who is bound fast to truth, capital T. And in the absence of direct knowledge and experience of truth, he or she is bound to the pursuit of truth. I should add here that the Buddha didn't and doesn't have exclusive rights to truth, just as Isaac Newton didn't and doesn't have exclusive rights to the law of gravity. The truth is simply the nature of reality. It's just what is. Consequently, it's freely available to everyone to experience, regardless of whether or not they identify themselves as a Buddhist. Several years ago, I spent a very enjoyable and inspiring evening with a Franciscan monk. As the hours progressed, our conversation deepened, and I was both surprised and heartened by the level of kinship that I felt with him. Our frameworks of understanding differed, but our aspirations resonated very strongly indeed. What was clear to me was that we were both, in our own ways, groping towards an experience of truth or reality. I called this Dharma, he called it God. I'm not sure that everyone would agree with this, But I personally accept that other religions, such as Christianity, at their best, at their very best, can and do point towards truth. But in my personal experience, and I have explored Christianity and Judaism, they just don't do it as fully, comprehensively, or as convincingly as Buddhism. So a question you may want to explore in your groups later is, who do I have more in common with? Either an intelligent and considered Christian or a non-religious scientist. And do you know why you think or feel that way? So, just to summarize this first section, truth is truth. No one and no religion has exclusive rights to it. Buddhism is committed to truth and the pursuit of truth. Truth is relevant to the whole of humanity. So this is what makes Buddhism a universal religion. What makes someone explicitly a Buddhist, as opposed to, say, a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew, is simply that he or she is explicitly committed to, or in our terms takes refuge in, the path to truth as taught by the Buddha. So what's meant by existential truths? I had to look this up because I wasn't sure. I'm still not sure. But anyway, Wikipedia says, let's start with existentialism. Existentialism is the philosophical study that begins with the human subject. Not merely the thinking subject, but the acting, feeling, living human individual. So, drawing from that, existential truths are what we might call the experienced facts that we all have in common as human beings. The experienced facts that we all have in common as human beings. So what are the existential truths that Siddhartha, the Buddha-to-be, had? Well, we all probably know about the 4 sights that resulted in Siddhartha leaving his privileged life as an aristocrat in order to become a homeless wanderer in search of freedom from dukkha, from suffering. It's the story that he left his palace with his faithful servant Channa on 4 separate occasions. On the first occasion, he saw an old man. On the second, a sick man. On the third, a dead man. And on the 4th occasion, he saw a holy man. Now, I've been a Buddhist for over 25 years, and I've taken this story as a given. Now, when I came to research this story and tried to find the canonical source for it. To my surprise, I quickly discovered that it doesn't exist, at least not in the early Pali Canon. The story is a later embellishment. The Buddha never recounted it about himself. It is in the early Pali Canon, but it's only in reference to a previous Buddha called Vipassi, not to the Buddha that we know. But it doesn't really matter, because what we do have in the Pali Canon, in the Anguttara Nikaya, or the numbered discourses, is the following account. It's a sutta. So I don't doubt that the legend, the story of the 4 sights came out of this sutta. So I'm going to read the sutta to you. It's not very long. And this is the Buddha, this is Ananda recounting what the Buddha said about himself. My lifestyle was delicate, mendicants, most delicate, extremely delicate. In my father's house, lotus ponds were made just for me. In some, blue water lilies blossomed, while in others there were pink or white lotuses, just for my benefit. I only used sandalwood from Kasi, and my turbans, jackets, sarongs, and upper robes also came from Kasi. And a white parasol was held over me night and day, with the thought, don't let cold, heat, grass, dust, or damp bother him. I had 3 stilt long houses, one for the winter, one for the summer, and one for the rainy season. I stayed in a stilt long house without coming downstairs for the 4 months of the rainy season, where I was entertained by musicians, none of them men. Basically, he had lots of women around him. While the bondservants, workers and staff in other houses were given rough gruel with pickles to eat, in my father's house they eat fine rice with meat. Amid such prosperity and such a delicate lifestyle, I thought, when an uneducated ordinary person who is liable to grow old, not being exempt from old age, sees someone else who is old, they are horrified, repelled, and disgusted. So they have this sense of revulsion arising from something unpleasant. Overlooking the fact that they themselves are in the same situation. So what he's pointing to here is that people are willfully ignorant. We deny or turn away. Denying or turning away is our default reaction or response to the truth of impermanence. You know, we're ostrich-like, we bury our head in the sand. Anyway, he carries on. But since I too am liable to grow old, it would not be appropriate for me to be horrified, embarrassed, and disgusted when I see someone else who is old. So this is him telling us, suggesting to us that it's skillful to really look at old age in the face and accept it as natural, as inevitable. It's a natural and inevitable consequence of impermanence and insubstantiality. And then he says, reflecting like this, I entirely gave up the vanity of youth. When an uneducated ordinary person who is liable to get sick, not being exempt from sickness, sees someone else who is sick, they're horrified, repelled, and disgusted, overlooking the fact that they themselves are in the same situation. But since I too am liable to get sick, it would not be appropriate for me to be horrified, embarrassed, and disgusted when I see someone else who is sick. Reflecting like this, I entirely give up the vanity of health. When an uneducated ordinary person who is liable to die, not being exempt from death, sees someone else who is dead, they're horrified, repelled, and disgusted, overlooking the fact that they themselves are in the same situation. But since too I am liable to die, it would not be appropriate for me to be horrified, embarrassed, and disgusted when I see someone else who is dead. Reflecting like this, I entirely gave up the vanity of life. These are the three vanities. What three? The vanity of youth, of health, and of life. Intoxicated with the vanity of youth, an uneducated ordinary person does bad things by way of body, speech, and mind. When their body breaks up after death, they are born in a place of loss, a bad place, the underworld, hell. Intoxicated by the vanity of health, an uneducated ordinary person does bad things by way of body, speech, and mind. When their body breaks up after death, they're reborn in a place of loss, a bad place, the underworld, hell. Intoxicated with the vanity of life, an uneducated ordinary person does bad things by way of body, speech, and mind. When their body breaks up after death, they're reborn in a place of loss, a bad place, the underworld, hell. So, I want to draw your attention that the sutta says that they are reborn in a place of loss. The one and only reason we experience loss is because we are attached and cling to what gives us pleasure or a sense of security. And when loss happens, as it inevitably does because all things are impermanent, we experience it intrinsically as painful or hellish. I think that's what he's saying here. That we don't have to take it that literally is a hell. What he's saying is loss is hellish. And we experience loss because we are attached. And the stronger the attachment, the more hellish is our experience of loss. So the sutta finishes with some verses which I'll just read, and they're a sort of summary of what's just been said. Intoxicated with the vanity of youth, health, or life, a mendicant rejects the training and returns to a lesser life. For others, sickness is natural, and so are old age and death. Though this is how their nature is, ordinary people feel disgusted. If I were to be disgusted with creatures whose nature is such, it would not be appropriate for me, since my life is just the same. Living in such a way, I understand reality without attachments. I mastered all vanities of health, youth, and even life. Seeing safety in renunciation, and this is really important, seeing safety in renunciation, zeal sprang up in me as I looked to extinguishment. Now I'm unable to indulge in sensual pleasures. There's no turning back, until the spiritual life is complete. So what is the meaning of these three sights? The three sights of old age, sickness, and death. Well, the existential truth of suffering is so important within Buddhism that it's giving pride a place in the Buddha's first teaching. In fact, it is his very, very first teaching, and that is the First Noble Truth, which is the truth of suffering. Suffering, or if you want to think about as the experience of unsatisfactoriness, is boldly stated as an incontrovertible fact of life. It's stated in a way that's totally in your face. If you're born, then you will suffer. You will experience unsatisfactoriness. This is 100% money-back guarantee. You will suffer. This focus and emphasis on the experience of suffering or unsatisfactoriness is the reason why many people are turned off by Buddhism. They see it as negative. They think it has a downer on life. It's miserable. But I disagree. I really very strongly disagree. The emphasis on suffering is the very reason that I am turned on by Buddhism. I appreciate its no-nonsense, straightforward approach. It's not escapist. It doesn't wrap up unpalatable truths in cotton wool. It just says it the way it is. It calls a spade, and at least for me, this is refreshing. The fact that my life is peppered, I have joy, but the fact that my life is peppered with suffering and unsatisfactoriness isn't news to me. But left to my own devices, I really would rather turn away and not think about it. Yet, Buddhism encourages me to face it. It encourages me to turn towards rather than away from my suffering. It says, look at this. Don't revel in it. Don't wallow in it. Don't add anything to it. Just look at it. Look at it deeply and allow yourself to experience it just as it is and learn from it. What does your suffering tell you? So this is another question which I put to you and ask you to explore in your group. What have you learned from your suffering, and can you learn more from it? So as I say, Buddhism doesn't sugarcoat anything. It doesn't infantilize me by telling me that God the Father is going to save me. No, Buddhism treats me like an adult. It expects me to have agency, and it encourages me to take responsibility. Earlier, I said that some people are turned off by Buddhism because they regard it as negative, as miserable. Ironically, other people are attracted to it because they think it's nice. If that's what you think, then I would argue that you're going to be sorely disappointed. No, Buddhism isn't negative, but neither is it nice. Metaphorically, Buddhism, the Dharma, presses your nose up against the mirror of life and says, look at this, beauty spots, warts and all. This is reality. I suppose this is what the Buddha did to Kisa Gotami. I imagine we're all aware of her story. So she was in deep grief, a lot of grief following the death of her baby. But the Buddha didn't mollycoddle her. He didn't say, there, it'll all be fine. Instead, he sent her on a quest to get a mustard seed from a house where there had been no death, no loss, no suffering. And through setting her this task, he helped her to discover for herself and come to terms with the fact that suffering is universal. Everyone suffers, as she was suffering. Yes, it's awful to lose a child. Surely there can be no greater loss. And yet, loss is the price we pay for being unenlightened human beings. It's the price we pay for our ignorance. It's the price we pay for conflating attachment with love. Kisa Gotami's child was the same as every other phenomena. Her child was conditioned and was therefore subject to impermanence and therefore death. From our unenlightened perspective, this feels like a hard truth, but it is the truth. And this is what we, like Kisa Gotami, have to come to terms with. The truth of suffering I would say, is what makes Buddhism a religion of humanity, because every unenlightened person on this planet suffers. It's the common denominator of humanity. And in my experience, people are most human when they are in touch with their suffering. I don't mean they're complaining and moaning about it. I just mean that they are open, tender, and vulnerable. Because I am an impermanent human being, because I am subject to old age, sickness, death, and loss, I am intrinsically vulnerable. Of course, life teaches me to cover this up with layers of armor, layers of defensiveness and protection. But when I see that vulnerability in another human being, the vulnerability that perhaps I can't fully accept in myself, then at that moment, I feel intimately connected, not separate from that other person. In that moment, I am seeing them in their full humanity. And in that moment, I am being my most human too. From a Buddhist perspective, this is what it means to be compassionate. If you've seen The Matrix, then you remember that the main character, Neo, was given a choice. He could either take the blue pill and opt for a completely deluded but pleasant existence, or he could opt for the red pill, which would mean living a more challenging but ultimately more real and meaningful life. Setting off on the Buddhist path is analogous to taking the red pill. Buddhism is all about being honest and getting real about our experience, about facing our suffering and the suffering of others. Because facing our suffering is the only way to freedom. In fact, getting real is freedom. Getting real does mean that Buddhism is not and cannot be a religion for people who are passive or choose to see themselves as victims. It's an heroic religion requiring fearlessness and courage. It's no nonsense, it's pragmatic, and I like that. I like it a lot. Perhaps more than anything, this is why I am a Buddhist. Facing and acknowledging suffering is the starting point or launch pad for the whole of the spiritual life. It is the very first step or link on the progressive spiral path towards enlightenment. And if you think about it, this makes perfect sense. After all, why would anyone seek to pursue a spiritual life if they were already happy and content? As you know, on the wheel of life there are 6 realms. At the top, there's a God realm where there is no suffering. It's a world of continual sensual delights. Then at the bottom of the wheel, there's a realm which is the hell realm, and there is constant suffering. As delightful as the God realm is, it's almost impossible to get enlightened from there. You can't get enlightened if you're in the God realm. The reason for this, is fairly obvious, I think. And the reason, well, if you're in the hell realm, you can get enlightened from there. In fact, you're quite likely, in some respects, to get enlightened if you're in a hell realm. There's a good chance of getting enlightened from the hell realm. Well, why is this? Give that some thought. Well, it's fairly obvious, isn't it? Because people in the hell realm have a real and urgent motivation to change. They do not want to stay there. I should add, just for a sense of completeness, that the most auspicious realm from which to get enlightened is the human realm. Hopefully the realm that most of us are in most of the time. And the reason for that is because there's roughly an equal measure of both pleasure and pain, pleasure and suffering, if you like. And so there's enough suffering to motivate us to want to change, but it's pleasurable enough not to make it overwhelming. That suffering that isn't overwhelming, hopefully for not most of us. Nevertheless, even if we have the good fortune to reside in the human realm, we still have to make effort. We have to make a lot of effort. Sangha once said that to get enlightened, you need to be just as focused and dedicated and disciplined in your spiritual life as a businessman who wants to become a millionaire. It's not easy. I've been around the Manchester Buddhist Centre for just over 20 years. And I imagine that like many others who've been around, I've noticed a fairly consistent pattern to people's interest and engagement in the Dharma life. And this is a pattern that I've followed too, so I'm talking about myself here. So people usually come to the Buddhist Centre because they're suffering in some way. Sometimes it's blatantly obvious, and other times it isn't. Perhaps they feel in turmoil because someone they love has died, or a long-term relationship's come to an end. Sometimes they come because they feel unmet, unseen, and alone in the world, or because they're traumatized. Loads of people come to the MBC because they've got a chronic illness, or they've been caught up in cycles of addiction. Other people come with a very different type of suffering. Even though they have all the trappings of worldly success, they have everything that they thought would make them happy: good health, good looks, a beautiful partner, a great career, material wealth, a loving family, status, power. They come, and yet this still isn't enough. They want something else. They want something more. They want something different in their life. And I suppose this was the experience of Siddhartha, when he was living in his palace or in his, in his privileged position. It's not uncommon to find people like this at the Buddhist Centre. Perhaps you are one of them. I'm sure every one of us here could provide our own variation on the theme of suffering and why we came to the Buddhist Centre. So another question for your group is, what were your reasons for coming to the Buddhist Centre? And I would suggest you only disclose what you're comfortable disclosing, but do try to be as honest as possible. Typically, what happens is that people come along, they first come along to a drop-in, maybe an introductory Buddhism course. We like the atmosphere of the centre and enjoy being around like-minded people. It's all new and exciting. Then we discovered we feel like we've discovered something special, something meaningful. We may even have a sense of coming home. I know I did. And consequently, we get all fired up. We're keen to learn more and we get more involved. We get to maybe have a glimpse of our own potential, our potential to change our life in line with the precepts and ideals. And maybe we take the risk of going on retreat like this one, or joining a study group. A while later, we might feel inspired and confident enough to request becoming a mitra. And some of us may even request ordination. And through all this skillful Dharma activity, we may find that our suffering gradually becomes less. We may begin to feel happier, more at ease with ourselves, with others, and the world around us. And this is wonderful to witness. It's really beautiful. My heart opens and softens when I see this happening. I'm proud that the Buddhist Centre, the Manchester Buddhist Centre, and the Dharma it teaches contributes to people's lives in this way. However, what also sometimes happens is that as the suffering reduces, so does the zest and zeal for a radical spiritual life. When we get comfortable, we also tend to become complacent, and so our spiritual lives plateau. Sadly, the only thing that seems to kickstart it again is a mighty dollop of suffering. I wish this wasn't the case, but it is. Suffering and insight into the nature of suffering provides the most basic and powerful motivation for the spiritual life. And without this, for most of us, there simply isn't the sense of urgency required to keep it going. This isn't a criticism, it's simply an observation of a common pattern, a pattern I recognize applies to me as much as to anybody else. Going back to the wheel of life, in the second concentric circle on that wheel, it's split into two parts, two sides. On one side, people acting skillfully are ascending upwards towards nirvana. On the other side, it shows people acting unskillfully and descending back into samsara. The spiritual life really is like a game of snakes and ladders. 1 minute you're motivated by dukkha to climb a ladder. The next minute, everything seems fine. So you slow down or stop striving, and before you know it, you find yourself sliding down a snake. That's just the way it is. All of this applies to me, just as much as to anybody else. I rather arrogantly think I'm a pretty good Buddhist, but I'm not exempt from what I've just said. In fact, Until the point of stream entry, nobody is. The people who appear to be most holy, pious, and spiritually committed today may well be the spiritual slackers of tomorrow, and vice versa. Of course, some people do fall by the wayside. However, many others come to see this pattern, learn from it, and accept it. If you are serious about practicing the Dharma, and you practice for long enough, then you will be humbled. Progress in the spiritual life is more often than not a matter of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So my advice to myself and anyone else who can be bothered to listen is to swallow your pride, develop your humility, and always, always play the long game. So I asked myself a question here, and that is, have I really experienced and seen the deeply existential truth of suffering the way the Buddha did? Well, the answer to that question is an emphatic no. Of course I haven't. If I had, then I would be enlightened, or at least I'd be much further along the path than I am. Nevertheless, I am certain that I became a Buddhist and continue to be a Buddhist because of the truth of suffering in my life. I suppose in some ways I've had a privileged life. You know, I have a loving family, good health, a better than average education, relative financial security, and numerous liberal freedoms. And still, at the age of 22, 30 odd years ago, I experienced an acute existential crisis that was the culmination of several years of gradually increasing unease. To the outside world, my life looked great, and superficially it was. But it all seemed so meaningless, and I felt completely desolate. I can't begin to describe the depths of my misery and despair. I tried all the usual distractions to keep it at bay, but nothing worked, at least not for long. The more I tried to deny dukkha or turn away from dukkha, the more it made itself known. It was only several years later, however, that I discovered Buddhism, and that I realized that there was a potential answer to my existential struggles. The Dharma helped. It really did, and it still does. Today, I know that I am a happier and healthier human being. However, my suffering has not disappeared. I continue to suffer, but what's different now is that I know why I suffer, and how I relate to my suffering has changed. I mainly suffer because, like Kisagotami, I am attached to people who are intrinsically unstable and impermanent. They're unreliable. They get old, they get sick, and they die. I suffer because I haven't yet fully come to terms with the fact that love and loss are 2 sides of the same coin. But I am getting better than I used to be. I'm moving in the right direction, and like everyone else, I just have to take the next step. So what happens in response to seeing the existential truth of suffering? Well, what Siddhartha did was he wanted to find a way of overcoming it. What arose, and you could say, well, this is what the 4th sight is. He saw a holy man, and that for him sparked this idea of overcoming suffering. What arose in Siddhartha was, the Pali term is samvega. And samvega is a distinctly Buddhist emotion, which according to Thanissaro, who's a fairly contemporary monk, scholar, he says that samvega is the first emotion you are supposed to bring to training, i.e. the first emotion you bring to the spiritual life. And he defines it as, and I think this is really important, samvega is the oppressive sense of shock, dismay, and alienation that comes with realizing the futility and meaninglessness of life as it is normally lived. A chastening sense of our own complacency and foolishness in having let ourselves live so blindly, and an anxious sense of urgency in trying to find a way out of the meaningless cycle. So I'm just going to read that again because I think this is really important. So this is the emotion that the Buddha felt when he saw suffering. An oppressive sense of shock, dismay, and alienation that comes with realizing the futility a meaninglessness of life as it is normally lived. And I think that as it is normally lived is really important. A chastening sense of our own complacency and foolishness in having let ourselves live so blindly. An anxious sense of urgency in trying to find a way out of the meaningless cycle. So this is what samvega is. This is what the Buddha felt, or Siddhartha felt. And this is what's worth discussing, really worth discussing in your group. Does any of this resonate for you? Do you experience samvega? Do you feel the futility and meaninglessness of life as it is normally lived? Do you really want to live differently? Do you have a sense of urgency for a more meaningful life? I can state with confidence that I do. I do know what samvega feels like. At times I've felt it very strongly, and it's certainly influenced some very, very important decisions in my life. I'm probably a lot poorer because of samvega. It is the reason why I actively sought out the Buddhist Center in the first place. It's the reason I became a mitra. And it was explicitly the reason why I requested ordination. I know I've recounted this before in other talks I've given, but I will just say it again. The reason I asked for ordination is because I had a dream. In fact, the first person I told this dream to was this man here, Mahabodhi. We were on a weekend, I was a mitra, and we were on a weekend retreat for men near Sheffield. And in this dream, I was doing my weekly shopping at Sainsbury's on a Saturday morning, and I had my shopping trolley around the veg counter. And the next minute, I knew there'd been an explosion somewhere, like a nuclear explosion. And I knew that there was a tsunami coming towards me. And the next minute in the dream, I was treading water with my partner at the time. And it was near the roof, near the ceiling, and the water was rising. And I knew I was going to die. And the overarching feeling within that dream was I was not afraid of dying. Not at all. I really was not afraid of dying. But what I felt really strongly was regret. I regretted not having lived the meaningful life I knew that I could have lived. And that was the motivation for me to ask ordination. I did have this sense of urgency. And I asked for it the next day, I think. However, despite all this, I know that my experience of samvega comes and goes. It isn't constant. There have been times in my life, like I just said, when I felt it intensely. But there have been other times, and there are other times, when I haven't and I don't feel it at all. It's been completely absent from my experience. And when this happens, I have to say that my life feels completely meaningless once again. And that is something I fear. I really do. I fear that more than old age, sickness, and death. I do not want to live a meaningless life. Nietzsche famously said that he, or I imagine she as well, one who has a why to live can bear almost any how. And I think that's true. That's what I feel. In the White Lotus Sutra, there's a well-known parable of the burning house. In the story, the children inside the burning house are playing with toys as everything around them catches fire. They don't notice the smoke and flames or the imminent danger. They don't really care, as long as they can continue playing with their toys. And this is the existential situation. This existential situation perfectly describes life, or contemporary life, in the 21st century. Our world is on fire. It's on fire with greed, hatred, and delusion, manifested by the fact that more and more of the world's resources are owned by fewer and fewer people. There's so much needless hunger and poverty in some countries, whilst in others there's obesity, mindless consumerism, and waste. For the last 40 years, we've been warned again and again about deforestation, environmental degradation, and climate change. Every day we hear about the rise of nationalism, populism, sectarianism, ethnic cleansing, religious fundamentalism, terrorism, and pointless shootings, wars resulting in a seamlessly endless flood of refugees and displaced persons. On our doorstep, we're faced with more and more homelessness, an epidemic of suicide, especially amongst young men, community breakdown, isolation, and loneliness. We are suffering. Our society is suffering. This planet is suffering. And like the children in the parable of the burning house, it's easy to turn a blind eye by distracting ourselves with our toys, our mobile phones, social media, Netflix, Xbox, Tinder, internet shopping, and all the other rubbish that keeps us from acknowledging and really facing the existential truth of our situation. Nearly finished. So what is the solution? Well, in the Upajjhatthana Sutta, the subjects for contemplation, the Buddha exhorts us to regularly reflect on 5 facts regarding life's fragility and our true inheritance. He says, there are these 5 facts that one should reflect on often, whether one is a woman or a man, lay or ordained. Which 5? I am subject to aging, have not gone beyond aging. This is the first fact that one should reflect on often, whether one is a woman or a man, lay or ordained. I am subject to illness, have not gone beyond illness. This is the second fact that one should reflect on often, whether one is a woman or a man, lay or ordained. I am subject to death, have not gone beyond death. This is the third fact that one should reflect on, whether one is a woman or a man, lay or ordained. I will grow different, separate from. I will lose all that is dear and appealing to me. This is the fourth fact that one should reflect on often, whether one is a woman or a man, lay or ordained. I am the owner of my actions, heir to my actions, born of my actions, related through my actions, and have my actions as my arbitrator. Whatever I do for good or evil, to that will I fall heir. This is the fifth fact that one should reflect on often, whether one is a woman or a man, lay or ordained. According to this discourse, contemplation on these facts leads to the abandonment or destruction of attachments and actions, and to the cultivation of factors necessary to awakening, to enlightenment. Through these reflections, we can fuel and keep alive the important emotion of samvega. And I do know that some people recite these every day, and it's really worth doing. So I'm going to finish in a moment, just reflecting on the fourth site that is not talked about in the Pali Canon. So in the sutta that describes Siddhartha's musings on the sufferings intrinsic to old age, sickness and death, as I've already said, there is no mention of the fourth site. There's no mention of him seeing a holy man who'd gone forth into homelessness. But I do think we can take it as a given that this is probably what happened. At that time in India, 2,500 years ago, there were plenty of shramanas, wandering mendicants. No doubt, Siddhartha, who was dismayed by the existential truth of suffering and the frivolousness of his privileged life, was intrigued and curious about these people who had given up everything valued by conventional society in order to pursue what they felt was most important. So what does the Shramana, the holy man, represent in the legend of the four sites? He represents faith, or at least the beginnings of faith. Faith in something higher. Faith that there is a solution to the existential problem of suffering. And this is important because faith prevents the experience of suffering turning into despair. Sangharakshita defines faith as the ultimate in oneself, resonating with what is ultimate in the universe. It's not rational. In fact, it's completely emotional. From a Buddhist perspective, it is the whole emotional side of the spiritual life. Some people, usually people who regard themselves as scientific and rational, are averse to the notion of faith. To them, it's too subjective, too woo-woo. But without it, the spiritual life would be a very dry affair indeed. And anyway, these scientific rationalists are just plain wrong. Why do I say that? Well, because I too am a scientist. Some people would debate that. I am a scientist. And I just happen to have studied the science of emotion. Intelligent people who have specific brain damage in the area of the brain where they are no longer able to feel emotion, but that's the only thing that's been affected in their brain. Well, you'd expect them to be like Dr. Spock in Star Trek. You'd expect them to be uber rational, but not emotional. And on the basis of that rationality, you'd expect them to be able to make better decisions. It doesn't happen. People who have lost the capacity for emotion make worse decisions. They make worse life decisions. They're worse at problem solving. You need emotion. There is such a thing as emotional intelligence, and it is important. The word emotion comes from the Latin word immovere. Immovere means to move, and that is exactly what emotions do. And it's because of this that I am almost certain that robots will not take over the world, at least not as they are currently, because robots do not have emotions. Robots cannot be motivated in the same way that humans can. It probably also explains why the world is a mess. Anyway, back to faith. Faith in general terms is the emotional side of the spiritual life. I've reflected a lot on faith, just in my own time and for myself. And I've come to the conclusion that beyond the general sense of it, it also has a meaning that is very close to trust. Specifically, trust in something that's important, trust in something higher. Research, this is me being scientific, scientific research has shown that trust has 3 component elements. You can break trust down into 3 elements. And those 3 component elements are competence, benevolence, and reliability. So you will trust in somebody, you need all 3, I should add. You will trust somebody who you believe, or you have a sense, is competent in some area that's important to you. But you also need to trust that they care about you, that they're benevolent. And you also need to have a sense that they are consistent. You know, they will bring both that competence and that benevolence again and again and again to the same sort of situations or to you. So you see them as reliable. So competence, benevolence, and reliability. And I think these perfectly match onto what Buddhism is about. If you take competence to its extreme, it's wisdom. If you take benevolence to its extreme, it's compassion. And reliability is the consistency of somebody showing you or demonstrating wisdom and compassion. You could say ethics, consistency in ethics. And that is what I am drawn to. That is what I trust in when I look at the Buddha. I see that. I can trust. When I look at this, what's highest in me resonates what's highest in that piece of stone. And what that highest is a sense of wisdom, compassion, and reliability. So I'm going to finish again just by reading the quote from Sangha and by posing those questions to you. In fact, I'll pose the questions to you first, and then I'll read the quote from Sangha. So the questions are, and there's many more I'm sure you'll ask in your groups. Who do I have more in common with? An intelligent and considered Christian or a non-religious scientist? Do you know why you feel or think that way? Secondly, what have you learned from your suffering? Can you learn more from it? Thirdly, what were your reasons for coming to the Buddhist Center? And try to be as honest as you feel you can be. And finally, do you experience samvega, the futility and meaninglessness of life as it's normally lived? Do you want to live differently? And do you have a sense of urgency for a more meaningful life? Some people say that Buddhism is just an Eastern religion. This is what some Christians in the West say. They say that because Buddhism is an Eastern religion. It cannot be understood and practiced by people in the West. Such Christians forget that Christianity itself is of Eastern origin. But Buddhism is in fact not an Eastern religion. It's a universal religion. Even though Buddhism originated in India, it spread over the whole earth. Buddhism can be understood and practiced anywhere in the world, because Buddhism addresses itself to the individual human being, regardless of race, nationality, caste, sex, or age. Buddhism is therefore a religion of man, of humankind, or humanity. This is one of the reasons why I am a Buddhist. I believe that humanity is basically one. I believe that it's possible for any human being to communicate with any other human being, to feel for any other human being, to be friends with any other human being. This is what I truly and deeply believe. This belief is part of my own experience. This is part of my own life. It is part of me. I cannot live without this belief, and I would rather die than give it up. To me, to live means to practice this belief. Therefore, this belief is part of my religion. It has nothing to do with the way in which I dress, nothing to do with what I call myself. It is the matter of the way I am, the way I exist. It is the way I naturally function in the world. This is what religion really is. It is what you most truly and deeply believe. It is what you are prepared to die for. It is your life. It is what makes you what you are. It is what makes you behave in the way that you do. Religion is therefore a very important thing. In fact, it is the most important thing. Thank you.